All right, hello and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about OCD and addiction, and really just anxiety and addiction. And really what I want to talk about in this episode are kind of basically how anxiety and addiction and OCD can essentially, overlap, right? And be kind of a dual diagnosis, where we could be deep wrestling with both things. And they can also exist independently of one another, right? People can deal with addiction and not deal with OCD and vice versa, right? And so I want to talk about kind of those three ideas in this episode. And so, real quick, if you benefit from these episodes and, you find value, we really appreciate if you would help us out by liking and subscribing and sharing this with people, so we can help get this information out to more people, because we know just how many people struggle with these types of things. And so our hope is to get resources in the hands of the people that need them. And so when we circle back to the idea of OCD and addiction, let's kind of go ahead and break down the similarities. So with OCD, you have the four components, right, that we're really looking at. You have the intrusive thought, right, that happens. That's what we call the obsession, right? And this generally takes the form of kind of a what if thought, right? What if something bad happens? What if something bad happened? What if I said something? What if I get contaminated, right? Takes on various different subtypes. And then that idea produces a stress response, and we feel it in the form of anxiety because the thought is usually past or future based. The anxiety that we feel is the same stress response we would feel as if we were in danger, right? But the problem is there's nothing actually to do because the threat's not happening right now. So we feel this surge of energy that we call anxiety, right? And other feelings can come up too, things like guilt, like shame, doubt, right? These feelings are all common too. And then we do a compulsion to alleviate that feeling, right? And so that's so the third part is the compulsion. The fourth step is the relief that we get. And so when we're talking about the OCD loop, it works like this. The thought happens, you get anxious, you do the behavior, you feel relief, and then the thought happens again, and this loop just kind of starts to build. Now, this isn't that unsimilar from addiction, right? Because, in Dr. Gabor Mate's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, I mean, he talks about it, and he says, with his experience working with addiction, that, chemical use or drug use is... And I'm going to use drug use, but again, addictions can take on so many different forms, right? They don't have to be just drugs, right? So let's talk about addiction from a much broader concept. But he talks about how our addictions usually exist as to serve the purpose of getting rid of pain versus pursuing pleasure, all right? And, because addictions can take on things like shopping, right? Even relationships, right? Sex and porn, right? All these things, right? Can become addictions, right? Along with alcohol, along with, weed and, and all the various pills and other kinds of, harder drugs. Addictions is really just a behavior that we do, right, again and again and again, and it usually offers some kind of temporary shift in our internal state. And again, which is not that dissimilar from a compulsion, right? Because when someone, let's say, has a compulsion of washing their hands because they're afraid, or that what if thought pops up about what if I get contaminated, and they feel anxious and they wash their hands, and that gives them that instantaneous relief, and then the thought just kind of, the loop just builds. Well, it's really not that dissimilar, right? From someone who, let's say, feels anxious, and then maybe they have what if thoughts, and then they feel anxious, but then they drink alcohol, and that causes that relief to kind of set in, and then the cycle that repeats itself. So, in my opinion, because addiction is such a broad concept, and broad scope of all the different things we can be addicted to, that cycle is very, very similar. Now, the one thing I would say that if I was working with someone who was experiencing both, in this context, I'm going to talk about the idea of using some kind of chemical addiction, right? Whether in really kind of some kind of mind-altering substance, anything from alcohol to marijuana to harder drugs, right? Like things like opiates, methamphetamine, something like that, right? I mean, benzodiazepines. When you're talking about having an addiction, when we talk about treating OCD, it's important to be sober, right? In the sense of like, if we're using chemical, if we have some kind of chemical dependency, how I would personally do it if I was working with someone it would have to be that the person would get clean before we worked on the OCD treatment, right? The reason being is because when we're dealing with OCD and anxiety treatment, one of the main components of it is, the exposure and response prevention, to expose ourselves to the uncomfortable feelings, right? And then prevent ourselves from engaging in the behaviors that are causing that temporary relief, to allow our body to habituate to the anxiety over time, right? And when it comes to someone dealing with OCD and addiction, yes, their drug use, right, whatever that drug is, can actually be the compulsion, right? So the treatments can overlap, absolutely. But if your coping mechanism is to use some kind of mind-altering substance, the problem is that if you don't have any kind of really control over that, right? Because that's one of the kind of things about addiction is that it just kind of takes over, right? In some cases. And if you're using some kind of substance on a ongoing basis, it's not going to allow for the treatment of OCD to work, right? So really getting the person clean, right, and being clean for a certain period of time before we start the ERP is going to be important. And actually, generally speaking, because the OCD is driving the drug use, getting clean and then doing the OCD treatment will hopefully allow for the drug treatment as well to be even more successful, right? Because you're treating, in some cases, the root cause. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone that has an addiction or struggles with addiction has OCD. That doesn't work like that, right? What I'm saying is when these two things are overlapping, when we know that this person has OCD and they also are struggling with a chemical dependency or some kind of dependency, getting sober first allows for a clear enough mind to even understand the treatment, right? And to even start to understand what we're doing. Because with OCD and anxiety treatment, that psychoeducation is so important. So we want the person to be sober, and we want, and then ultimately, if the drug use was part of the compulsive behaviors, yes, we are going to aim to stop that. But getting sober to the point where you can at least go through the psychoeducation and begin to understand the fundamentals of the treatment and begin low-level exposures is going to be paramount to the person's success. So, obviously this works on a case-by-case basis. This isn't like a catch-all, like everyone needs to follow this path. But this stuff, a lot of times will go hand in hand. And that's why it's important to understand that if we are going to be working with someone who is experiencing both, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to first start with sobriety and then move into OCD treatment. Now, if you're treating individually, then you treat them individually. But I just kind of wanted to talk about how they overlap, right? And I wanted to talk about if we are dealing with both, if there's a dual diagnosis. In my opinion, it's important that we treat the sobriety, or we get sober first, right? And if for a long enough time to where you'll even be receptive to the treatment. And then once we initiate with the ERP treatment, acceptance, commitment therapy, mindfulness, in my experience, that will actually reinforce a lot of the treatment that's done with the addiction as well. So that's kind of how that would work together. So hopefully that's helpful. And, if you struggle with OCD, anxiety, or other forms of psychological stress, we actually have resources for you right down in the notes here below this. So, there's free downloads and other free trainings. We also have our support community where we do live Zoom calls. And so you can check that out as well as some of our more premium trainings over at restoredminds.com. So thank you so much for tuning in and hanging out during this episode. I hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care. Hey there, Matt here, and thank you for watching that video. And if you're struggling with stress and anxiety, I just want to let you know that I have a free 7-minute meditation that I'd like to give to you. You can just click the link right down in the notes to get instant access, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon.